So as an independent, researcher, he has been studying the life and thought of Dr. BR Ambedkar since 2003. The output of his efforts, as Professor Vishnu Mahapatra just told, apart, an intellectual biography of Dr. Ambedkar that draws, a number of English and Marathi sources and provides a wealth of material previously unavailable in English. So he lives in Pune with his wife and daughter and a cat. So I welcome Gopalji, Ashokji for Krea University. I hope we could have done this in a better way, in the sense that physically, but as Professor said, Vishnu, it's better this way also. So I welcome both of you. So Geetha, please.
Thanks, Sam, for that generous introduction. And I'm glad that Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium is remembered, because it's one of my favorite books of things that I've written. And many thanks for inviting me to speak on the occasion of Baba Saheb Ambedkar's birth anniversary. And it's been a season of birthday gifts for Baba Saheb, with Ashok Gopal's Apart being released on his birthday on April 14th. And there's also Scott Stroud's book on the evolution of pragmatism in India, which looks at the relationship between Ambedkar's thought world and that of his favorite teacher, John Dewey. There's also Akash Singh Rathor's slim volume on Ambedkar's life, which was also released in April, and we await a second volume there. Then there is Syed Saeed's set of essays on the annihilation of caste. So it's been a kind of a season of books on Baba Saheb. Keep that in focus. But then, actually, if you look back and you try and build a bibliography of writings on Ambedkar, you see that there's been a steady sort of production of texts over the last 30 to 40 years. And there are several anthologies, for instance, which focus on one or the other aspects of his thought world, on political representation and democracy, or on the Buddha and Buddhism and what his turn to Buddhism means or can be taken to mean. There's also standalone essays, as well as essays that feature in anthologies on his provocative and contentious book, Pakistan or the Partition of India. Then there are some really unusual long essays, such as Santosh Suratkar's work on the Independent Labour Party, which hasn't attracted as much attention as it perhaps ought to. Then you've got these really interesting volumes, Aishwari Kumar's Radical Equality, where he undertakes a philosophical lens to the thought worlds of both Gandhi and Ambedkar. And then there's Shomyabrata Chaudhary's book, Ambedkar and Other Immortals. So there's been really a sort of publishing from different contexts, addressing different themes, a very wide expanse of literature that has come to be over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think this is probably going to continue for a long time to come. And much of this owes to the sort of resolute ways in which Dalit memory is held on to Ambedkar, and with a density of young Bahujan Dalit scholars in our institutes of higher education, there's also this opening up of fields of discussion and debate, and equally the evolution of Dalit politics on the ground has enabled a wider dispersion of Ambedkarite ideas and thought. And while there's a lot of contention on how we approach his life or his ideas, what you have in place is a very lively discursive and political field of argumentation. And this is not just in English, but in the many languages of the subcontinent. I can, of course, only speak of Tamil, but I know that there's lots of discussions around Baba Saheb's ideas in small and large forums. People have taken inspiration from this or that text and gone off to do things in the realms of culture, in the realms of art, and much else. So what you really then find with the figure of Ambedkar in scholarship is he stands at the intersection of what you might call, history and public memory. where Dalit political expression intersects with Ambedkar's thought world and then opens up many directions for research, contemplation, argument. And what's fascinating is that the diversity of sources from which people draw to make their claims and arguments. So on the one hand, you have popular literature, uh, whether it's folk songs, whether it's, these little booklets that get published every so often, part of which is comprises writings from Ambedkar, part of which has to do with the writer's own preoccupations with with the Ambedkarite political universe. Then you, of course, have memoirs of Ambedkarite activists, of Dalit activists. You also now, of course, have cinema, which draws on the iconography around Ambedkar. And these sit alongside jottings from the archives, um, impossible sources that you thought were very difficult to track, like jottings on labor files that Ambedkar made when he was a member for labor in the Viceroy's cabinet. And those things are there now in the India Office Library. But you have young scholars working with such material. You also have people tracking references to Ambedkar in the letters of his contemporaries. And recently I came across a fascinating reference to both Periyar and Ambedkar in the writings of, in the letters of M.R. Jaikar. So it's quite a rich world of sources out there, and how these sources sit with each other is a problem, a very interesting problem for biographers, and I'm sure Ashok will be able to tell you a lot more about it since he's worked with both Marathi and English sources, with primary as well as secondary sources. And how does one put the story together? How does one do justice to a very resilient and affectionate popular memory about Ambedkar while also holding on to certain sorts of rigorous perspectives on how we understand this and that aspect of his thought. And as a young student in one of the Ambedkarite gatherings I was part of said, how does one do justice to the profundity of that life and that thought world while also learning to disagree with aspects of his thought? And I think that is something that the current generation will probably grapple with over a period of time. And in terms of how one might think of some of this scholarship, I'm going to speak of it in terms of my own work. But before that, I would like to also suggest that the story of how we come to think about Ambedkar is essentially a plural story. And I want to spend the rest of the time that I have in talking about how any engagement with his life and work is necessarily a situated one. And it's not simply one that comes out of our biographical interest in Ambedkar, our own personal biographies which lead us to him, but also the wider historical context within which Ambedkar is spoken about and talked about and passed on down the generations. So if for instance, you were to take Tamil Nadu, Ambedkar has been referenced in debates to do with caste, Brahmanism, untouchability, the Buddhism from as early as the 1920s, just about the time that he made his advent into public life. And here, of course, one must keep in mind that there's been a long history of thinking and organizing against caste on the part of Dalits in the Madras presidency. And as far as the Tamil-speaking areas go, this goes back to the 19th century, to the 1860s, in fact, if not earlier. And so if, for instance, you take figures such as M.C. Raja, who was one of the first nominated Dalit members to the Madras Legislative Council, or Veerayan, who was a contemporary of Raja, and L.C. Gurusamy, another contemporary, and better known R. Srinivasan, who went with Ambedkar to the first roundtable and the second roundtable conferences. These men had already begun a very active debate in the legislature and outside of it in terms of civil rights for Dalits, in terms of what Dalits deserve from the colonial state. So when Ambedkar's ideas sort of get to be disseminated in the Madras presidency, they sit alongside this already extant politics of organizing and this existing discourse of rights and entitlements that Dalits are arguing for. And this is something that another very fascinating book points to, Manoj Mitta's Caste Pride, The Battle for Equality in Hindu India, which is a fascinating collection of stories about legislation against caste-based discrimination. And no surprises that much of that history is located in the Bombay and Madras presidencies. So that's, of course, something very interesting. So you have then this Dalit historical context within which Ambedkar has been sort of absorbed and been part of a wider discourse of rights. And then also you have the non-Brahmin movements reckoning with Ambedkar, which starts really in the late 1920s. But the earlier precursor of the non-Brahmin movement, the South Indian Liberal Federation or the Justice Party, the leaders of the Justice Party were very familiar with the non-Brahmin movement in the Bombay presidency. They were also familiar with the kinds of anti-caste expressions that Dalits were putting forth. And they knew the work done by Shahu Maharaj of Kolhapur as well. So there was that give and take between these two movements. And the Madras non-Brahmin movement, clustered around the Justice Party, also engages with Ambedkar in the 1920s. And what's very interesting is that leading members of the Justice Party, alongside Dalits, anticipate Ambedkar's burning of the Manusmriti at Mahad by burning the text a few months earlier in different parts of the Madras presidency. So there's a lot of that happening as well. But I think the most fitful engagement between the non-Brahmin movement and Ambedkar comes during the debates around the Pune Pact, when both the Periyar and his followers and the self-respect movement, as well as the official non-Brahmin party, the Justice Party, support Ambedkar's position on representation for Dalits through separate electorates. So you have a constant reference to Baba Saheb in the writings of that period. So you have these two trajectories of engagement, one from within a history of Dalit organizing and thinking, which is relatively autonomous of the non-Brahmin movement, with which it, of course, intersects in various ways. And then the way in which Ambedkar was also referenced and spoken of within the non-Brahmin movement. And what is fascinating is that together, this sort of medley of voices that you get from Madras until almost the 1940s echoes arguments made with respect to nationalism, which can be traced back to Pandit Ayodhya Das. So as we all know from Ambedkar's famous essay on Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah, he made a case for social revolution as perhaps a kind of an advance guard for political revolution. And he felt that that had been compromised in the struggle for Indian nationalism. And one of the first expressions of that idea was from Ayodhya Das, who distinguished between what he called the people and the nation. And he said, liberty and equality for the people is not the same as liberty for the nation from colonial rule. And liberty and equality for the people necessarily entails challenging caste and untouchability. So you have all these ideas sort of meshing and segueing into each other. So Ambedkar sort of is very much part of the organic development of non-Brahmin and Dalit politics in this presidency. And I would like to again insist on this fact that the relative autonomy of the Dalit movement was perhaps responsible for foregrounding his thought world after the 1940s, because the sections of the Dalits that were part of the wider non-Brahmin movement decide to join his Scheduled Caste Federation when it was set up in the 1940s, even though earlier some of them had disagreed with him with respect to the Pune Pact and also with respect to his decision to convert out of Hinduism. So MC Raja, for instance, disagreed with him on the Pune Pact. He wanted joint electorates with reserved seats. Srinivasan, who was his comrade in London during the roundtable conferences, disagreed with his decision to convert. But then by the 1940s, you find a significant section of Dalit political actors and thinkers rally behind Ambedkar and the Scheduled Caste Federation. In fact, the only official English weekly of the Federation was published from the Madras province, Jai Bhim, which was edited by Sivaraj. So that's the way in which Ambedkar continued to be remembered in Madras, in and through Ambedkarite organizations largely, though until the 40s, both the non-Brahmin movement and the Dalit movement upheld his political claims and his arguments about history and society and culture. But subsequently, it was the Dalit movement that kept his memory alive and sustained his presence in Tamil public thought and politics. Not just the Scheduled Caste Federation, but the Republican Party of India. And I think an interesting side story is how the Gandhians and the Congress, and the Dalits in the Congress also were shaped by Ambedkar's ideas. And this is also fascinating. So you have someone like Swami Sahajanand, who was a Gandhian, but who supported Ambedkar when it came to the Pune Pact. And then you have men like L. Ile Perumal, who were part of the wider Congress nationalist circle. And you have that amazing Ile Perumal committee report, which was put out on the 1960s on the status of the scheduled caste. But he was significantly influenced by Ambedkar as well. So the Dalit reckoning with Ambedkar in Tamil Nadu is a story that awaits to be told on its own terms. But I want to sort of reference that because for any of us who wanted to work on Ambedkar, it is this history that proved enabling. But this history was not available to us as such, for the simple reason that the political success of the Dravidian movement, which you can date back to the 1960s, constructed a tale of non-Brahmin, anti-Brahmin, and anti-caste descent, which did not foreground the role of Dalits. Neither did it account for the relative autonomy of Dalit politics. So it was only in 1991, with the 100th anniversary of Baba Saheb's birth, that you have a new generational focus on Ambedkar and his writings, a new generation of political actors and thinkers who push Ambedkar back into public memory. And my own interest in Ambedkar, I would trace back to that time when I was working on the book along with S.V. Rajadurai, which subsequently became Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium. And I think it was that moment that made it possible for us to access the writings of Ayotitas. Though Ayotitas was known to Dalit intellectuals and kept alive in their journals and their magazines, he was not available to the wider Tamil public until Dalit intellectuals pushed them forward into public memory. And then you had others picking it up. And we were part of those others who then worked with sources that had sort of were unexplored until that time. And after us, there was G. Aloysius, who came and did a far more expansive research on Ayotitas. So much of the current interest in Ambedkar in Tamil Nadu owes a great deal to the renewed interest in his life and work that unfolded in the 1990s, and largely on account of a new intellectual generation comprising largely of Dalits that emerged and became very active at that time. So in that context, some of us started reading Ambedkar very seriously, and it was important for us because we were looking at a period in history where he was very active along with the self-respect movement. But interestingly enough, I think for us, what became very obvious as we finished our work on the Tamil non-Brahmin movement and also aspects of Dalit organizing and thought, that it just simply wouldn't do to address modern history in the Indian context in terms of the two great traditions of thought within which it's usually discussed, nationalism and communism. But you actually needed to also put in place and account for a very distinctive third tradition of thought, which can be called the anti-caste philosophical and political tradition of thinking about society and the polity and the economy. And when we finished our book on Periyar and the non-Brahmin movement and the self-respect movement, one of the en passes we marked in that text was between the left and the non-Brahmin movement in the Madras presidency, and how issues of economic, social, and political justice were intertwined in very different ways in both these movements. Of course, we didn't concentrate on the left as much as we did on Periyar movement, but that was a question that lingered for me. And it sort of acquired a certain urgency when from 2015, I was part of an endeavor called Let's Read Ambedkar, where we sort of undertook these camps in different parts of Tamil Nadu, sort of putting together a syllabi on how to read Ambedkar and having this really interesting motley group of people who would join together for anything between 4 days to 8 days to read Baba Saheb's writings and discuss them. And to date, we've had more than about 25 to 28 of those meetings just within Tamil Nadu. And it was then I also got to know these wonderful Dalit political and life worlds and cultural universes. And again, this question of, why is it that um, the left movement did not engage with this extremely active group of people on the ground who address caste and class in an everyday sense, from everyday struggles for access to something like a well, or for rights to land, homestead land, or for broader issues such as gaining rights that had been promised in the constitution. Why is it that the Indian left has not reckoned enough with these myriad struggles that happen every day in village after village? And given my own politicization through the left and feminist movements, I wanted to set up a conversation between these traditions. And it was out of that impulse that my book, Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar and the Question of Socialism in India, came to be written. And I owe a great deal to these wonderful Let's Read Ambedkar sessions of which I was a part, because without them, I don't think I would have been able to do this book. So in that sense, it's also something that belongs to a wider historical context and things that I picked up from that context. So what I've done in that book, I'm just going to take you very quickly through it. One is, of course, I didn't want to consider Baba Saheb's ideas within a normative framework of Marxism, however you define it, whether you define it along to neo-Marxist scholarship, whether you define it according to Indian Marxist understanding of issues at stake. But I didn't want to do that. What I instead wanted to do was to read Ambedkar's writings in an adjacent sort of way, place them next to his peers, what his peers were saying on any number of issues that he was concerned with as well. Peers from the left, but also peers from the nationalist camp. Because as students of history, we know that there was sort of a diffuse relationship between the nationalists and the communists. In certain moments during the struggle, they were polarized. In certain other moments, they sort of held together. And there was a free flow of personnel and ideas between the two camps, especially after the late 1920s. So I thought what I ought to do in this book is to look at a set of issues and see how Ambedkar's ideas sit alongside the ideas of his contemporaries. And of course, I couldn't afford to be encyclopedic. I don't have that scholarship, but I did want to work with the official archive of the Communist Party of India, the documents of the Communist Party of India, which many of us have used, and also with well-known texts of the Indian nationalist movement. And I picked on a set of issues. The first one was, of course, and I chose these issues because they are the ones that have often been used against not just Ambedkar, but also the broader anti-caste movement to sort of negate their centrality to Indian political and social thought. So the first is, of course, the attitude towards the colonial state. So there's this commonsensical perception that anti-caste activists were pro-colonial, to put it in a very sort of bland, bald sense. So I wanted to think through responses to colonialism and the colonial state, and what might that be if you are Dalit, if you are from the margins, and if the colonial moment is also a moment that opened up certain aspects of the public sphere to you that had kept you out until then. So you see this in text after text, not just in the writings from Madras, but in writings from across the subcontinent. And this is something that scholarship over the last few decades has unfolded for us. So how do you then rethink the response to colonialism and the colonial state? And in that context, I pointed to Ambedkar's critical as well as productive engagement with the state, that he had a very sharp sense of what colonial rule was all about. But on the other hand, the circumstances in which Dalits find themselves pointed to what I call a long durée of oppression and exploitation, which cannot be folded within the colonial moment, but which stretches backwards. So therefore, I wanted to place his ideas alongside that of Nehru, Gandhi, M.N. Roy, and the Communist Party's leading thinkers from that time. So that was one aspect. The second, of course, was his understanding of time and history. The communists, of course, have a certain vision of how the future would unfold, their sense of revolution and progress. The nationalists have their sense of how the nation would emerge. So what was Ambedkar's sense of the future? What was his reckoning with history? And why is his understanding of time something that has to be marked as its own understanding and not be measured only against communist views or against wider struggles for national self-determination? So that's something that I try and do by looking at how his thought about history was shaped and what were the influences that shaped it. And here I sort of also felt that what was very central to Ambedkar's thought world was that much of his forays into scholarship have to be seen in terms of what was central to his life and politics, the annihilation of caste. So understanding in this sense had to necessarily lead to annihilation. So how might you then understand caste so that you can grasp it in ways that would help annihilate? And then I compare his thought on caste to whatever else others were saying about caste and untouchability, not simply ethnologists, scholars, which is something that post-colonial writers do, but also what the left was saying about caste. And I think that is something that is an important question for us to keep in mind. Likewise, how did the left understand the intersection of caste and class in everyday struggles? And how might Ambedkar's ideas help us unpack that? Without lowering the intensity and the centrality of those struggles, how might one also notice their limitations? And what does Ambedkar allow us to do in that respect? So that's something I do. But I think the most important part of that book has to do with Ambedkar's theorization of caste, especially the centrality he grants to the sphere of social reproduction. Not simply endogamy, which reproduces caste, but everything else that affirms endogamy, whether it's a textual affirmation through the Manusmriti, whether it's custom, habit, whether it's the philosophical endorsement of Varna Dharma that you get in a range of texts, including the Bhagavad Gita. So Ambedkar's very expansive and layered understanding of social reproduction. So that's something I think I place at the central argument in my book, because much of the argument about caste and class, socialism and Ambedkarite thought revolves around production and labor. But if social reproduction is taken to be a very central aspect of how caste is reproduced, then you see how not just Ambedkar, but the wider anti-caste movement, because Periyar was equally interested in social reproduction, how they actually open up avenues for you to think about intimacy, conjugality, caste family, sexuality, and that then becomes very important. And lastly, of course, I look at Buddhism, Ambedkar's turn to Buddhism. And throughout the book, I make an argument for Ambedkar's extremely anguished understanding of what caste does, apart from what it prevents you from doing, what it actively does to the human person. And how, in his definition of the caste order as ascending scale of reverence and descending scale of humiliation, no one is equal to the other. And this denial of coeval-ness, equality, what does it do to each of us? How each of us is a partial human person, therefore. And what does it do to those who are designated untouchable? As he says in the Southborough Commission, confiscated. And he goes on to build on that in different ways. So what does it do to the self? And he was very interested in social psychology and very interested in the ontological wounding that comes out of caste. So therefore, his journey to Buddhism, I mark as a journey which helps him attend to that ontological and ethical wounding that the caste society inflicts on everybody, but which only Dalits actually own up to and see as a problem. So I also point to how the move towards Buddhism is a departure towards another world, which doesn't mean that he has given up on his earlier political work or on his understanding of economic and social justice, of what the state owes its citizens, of his opposition to private property, and many other issues that are part of his thought world. So my attempts in that book were to sort of make Ambedkar's writings speak to a whole plethora of concerns, much of which has to do with communism, but which are also, I think, concerns that bother a great many people who deal with inequality at every level, whether it's social, economic, whether it has to do with race, whether it has to do with ethnicity, whether it has to do with being designated Adivasi or designate oneself as Adivasi. So how might his thoughts speak to all of these concerns? And I find that important because there is a certain utopic energy in Ambedkar, a certain refusal to not cave into cynicism or to opportunism. And I think that becomes something that you wish to hold on to and take forward in many ways. So that's what I've tried to do in my book. I don't know how to characterize it. I think it is something that has come out of concerns that I recognize is not only our mind, but which are imminent to the struggles of Dalit people in the subcontinent, and particularly in the context I know best, which is Tamil Nadu. So that's where we are with my work, and I like to stop here and pass the mic on to Ashok.
Thank you, Geetha Garu. May I request Ashok ji to take over?
Yeah. So at the outset, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, especially the students. So speaking after Geetha is a tough act to follow. So, and I will speak in a very different way, on a very different topic. As Vishnuji told me, the topic would be on significance of Ambedkar today. And I told him initially, like, look, this is a huge subject and hardly something for a 1 hour or half an hour interaction. But he said, and also I made it clear that, if you talk about significance of Ambedkar as a political figure in today's context, in today's politics, it is a subject which I am not really I have not studied much, and I cannot claim to be an expert on that. But however, there is a significance of Ambedkar in people's lives, which I have experienced personally, and of course, people I met in my journey of writing this book. Many people whom we would normally call Ambedkarites, but they may also not call themselves Ambedkarite, how Ambedkar influences them in their day-to-day lives. And I thought that is the subject I would talk about. What is the significance of Dr. Ambedkar's life and thought in our lives as students, academics, and citizens concerned about democracy. Of course, the ground rule is that it is Ambedkar is of significance only if you value democracy. If you do not value democracy, there is really no point reading Ambedkar. You are better off reading, say, Adolf Hitler or somebody else. So if you value democracy, and especially in the way he explains it, then Ambedkar's significance in the here and now, today that we have, leaving aside, as I said, the implications for political activity and political movement, which is really quite complex, and the kind of understanding Ambedkar brought to politics is probably quite inadequate for facing the challenges we face today. So that is a subject I would not go into, but I would talk about in our individual lives. Just as, for example, Gandhi is a very influential people even today in their daily lives. So I believe Ambedkar is and can be for more people. So one is, of course, when we talk about his life story itself is extremely inspiring. It's a story of struggle, tremendous struggle. It is not only a struggle of because of the social background, but later also because of his political stand. He stands against the national movement, and that, of course, means enemy number one for many people. Then, because of his marginalized position, he has a problem of resources. He doesn't have the kind of, resources in terms of manpower and money that is required to sustain a movement. He doesn't have that. He himself has livelihood. He struggles to earn a livelihood. Then he has health issues. and he has disappointments with later in life with his colleagues, and he has a sense towards the end, a sense of disappointment that he has not done enough for his people. So with all this, but he continues with great determination. He never gives up. So this is a very, very inspiring story. It has to be read, I think, by everyone. And how we take it is, well, recently Geetha and I were in a event in Chennai, but there were a lot of young Dalit writers, students, artists. So one particular Dalit woman writer who has just started reading my book and is reading just some sections, and she's also an activist. So she said, I'm just going through this and I realize, whatever I'm doing is so little. No? So that way you can say Ambedkar shows how much can be done in a life, and I suppose it's a healthy corrective to some inflated egos also. It is useful to know, not really treat him as a very great man, but nevertheless, not sort of idolize him or something, but still there is a lot to be learned from his struggle. Secondly, of course, his enormous range of reading is also something from which we can take a lot. Which he shows in his very first paper, that is, he writes on castes in India. He's just 25. And in that paper, he shows his comfort with different domains of knowledge. So it's like, and then we see this throughout his life. He has an enormous range of reading, but it is purposeful reading. He's not reading for pleasure, so to speak. And he brings this range of reading into his writings with an original insight. So basically, much before this term multidisciplinary became common in academia, Ambedkar was a multidisciplinary student, a multidisciplinary person in the field of education. And that, I think, is really something we can learn a lot. Specifically, like you take an example, he talks about, he gives advice to lawyers. What do you need to become a good lawyer? So he says, it's not good enough to learn law. It's not good enough to learn law. You have to learn sociology, you have to learn psychology, you have to learn ethics, and of course, you have to develop rhetoric, the art of persuasion. So only then can you become a lawyer. So it's even on such a technical field like law. He says you need to be knowledgeable in other domains also. So when he talks about in his educational institutions very far, which he is founded, the advice he gives to students is also like that. So because essentially he wants people to get educated to solve problems of real life, to solve problems that are faced by a large number of people. That is the purpose of education, and that requires a wide range of understanding. So that, I think, is one thing that definitely, as students and as people interested in social issues, is something we can take a lot from Ambedkar. That is so far as far as his life is concerned. Now, in terms of his ideas, in some terms of his core concerns, there are many that one can talk about, but I will just focus on three ideas. That is his idea of caste, his idea of social democracy, and his what he later said was Dhamma. So how does this all play out in our lives today, and how can his understanding help us? On caste, as we know, he considered it to be the key determinant of opportunities and living conditions in India. And it is not that he said that caste is the only determinant. He was also well aware of economic and language. He talked about linguistic nationalism and communalism, that is to say, religious nationalism. So there were a lot of other determinants, but he did focus a lot on caste. And initially, in his first paper, he talks about the role of endogamy. Then he comes to this notion of Brahmanism, which he says is not just restricted to Brahmins, but is seen across the castes, the innate feeling of superiority, which is across castes, you can see it. And then he tries to identify the root of this Brahmanism, and based on the experiences that he had in the in two struggles in Mahad and then in Nashik, which were both the struggles were about issues. There was no material issue at stake. In one case, it was an access to a tank with dirty water, and the other case, it was an access to a temple just to get a darshan of a god. And that was all there was to it. And the protest was so violent and stupid that he won. And these were not people who were gundas, these were sort of, normal, sort of decent folk. Why are they acting like that? So he thought that is because of the influence of religion. Uh, Today, I think with our whatever knowledge we have about how stigma works and how it is constructed and how it is transmitted, I think we can very well enrich that knowledge of how caste works, that it is not only a matter of religious sanction and material interests can be, may not be obvious, but there is a larger framework to all this. And it could well be that it is only a matter of just, asserting on having a sense of self esteem or self pride that comes automatically without you doing anything, and you don't want to lose it. So caste, how it works today is a matter of study still, and it probably works differently than it worked in his time. But nevertheless, the notion of Brahmanism is very useful for all of us, because it alerts us to the fact that when he says that it runs across the caste, all castes, it basically means that all of us carry some of it, definitely. And this is not something we develop, it's not something we learn, it is like a baggage that comes along with our position. So it is something I think really worthwhile looking for us as a matter of self-reflection, and what is the Brahmanism in me. Along with that, of course, Brahmanism, this innate sense of superiority doesn't come only from caste, it also comes from gender. And in India, it comes from some other things, like, for example, you have a convent school education, so you carry with, so you go through life with this sense of superiority. You may not have adopted it consciously, but it is a baggage that you carry. So this notion of Brahmanism, if it is expanded to other privileges also, I think that is a useful, very useful concept for us to consider, particularly when we consider his next idea, which is of social democracy. As you know, social democracy, the way he used it is not in the way it is used in his time, or it was used in his time, or it is used today. Social democracy is in word more used by socialists in Western democracies. He used it in a very particular manner, and he spoke about it most eloquently in his last assembly to the last speech to the Constituent Assembly, where after doing everything, after the entire constitutional framework is created, he tells the Constituent Assembly that, look, whatever we have erected is not going to be of much use. It is, this political democracy is just one thing. What we really need to get at is social democracy. That is a democracy as a way of life and a democratic society. Now, again, that is all that he spoke there, and unfortunately, later in life, he could not get the time to develop on this notion of social democracy. But we can understand it with reference to some earlier works. So, although the word social democracy may not be mentioned there. So, for example, from Annihilation of Caste, he uses the notion used by his teacher John Dewey, which is associated living, and you can read more about how he uses Dewey in the work by Scott Stroud, which Geetha mentioned. but I have briefly discussed it in my book. But in any case, the point is he uses Dewey in his own way. And I would like to just read that definition of Dewey, which of associated living, because it is very rich with meaning and it helps us understand a lot about Ambedkar and the kind of society he imagines. So when he talks about associated living, so he brings it in this context. He talks about an ideal society. So an ideal society should be mobile, he says. He is quoting Dewey in his own way. An ideal society should be mobile, should be full of channels for conveying a change taking place in one part to other parts. In an ideal society, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be varied and free points of contact with other modes of association. And then he says, this is fraternity. But this last bit is not from Dewey, it is not Dewey, this is his own. This is his own. So if you take the last bit, this is fraternity, he says. And if you read again this part about what happens in an ideal society, about sharing of interests and viewpoints and points of contact, what comes to us is that he is not putting across fraternity as some kind of nice, moral, ideal, nice thing to have. He's not, his fraternity is not that, hum sab bhai bhai hai, ek saath rahenge, and all that sort of stuff. It is not, his fraternity is not that sort of camaraderie that comes in some corporate training programs where everybody wears a t-shirt and, one day they are together. And this fraternity, this notion of communication and sharing is basically related to the development of your full development of your human personality. This notion of fraternity is basically an educative notion, that it is through such processes of association with a varied number of people with varied life experiences that the human personality develops. And this is what one requires for lifelong education. So and to for these varied points of contact in which and interactions, if you want to gain from this, it is obvious that you have equality is implied because you have to treat all experiences as valuable. It is obvious that liberty is implied because you are going to express your views openly, and you would respect the rights of others to express their views and share their experiences, and you would value all of this. So so democracy. So you can, when you think about this, you can see how social democracy could work. And you can bring it down, you can understand this very clearly in some context, like for example, school education. In the context of school education, this is what I have been working on for many years on a project in Maharashtra and Goa. So how do we help children develop democratic attitudes and values? So one of the things that we do is that, of course, is to facilitate this exchange of experiences, varied experiences in the classroom. So now, like I will give you a typical, some of it, of course, one doesn't have to do. In some classrooms, this is already there. For example, in a classroom in Madgaon in Goa, in the center of Goa, is a government school that I visited. There are only about 8-10 children who are from Goa proper. The rest are all children of migrants from different parts of India. So it is a multicultural, multilingual classroom to start with itself. And the teachers negotiate it in their own way, mostly with a lot of positivity. What our activities do there is, like, for example, really make it a part of school routine that you have to talk about your home, your family, your background. And all this happens in a structured manner, but in an open atmosphere. And children gain a lot from each other. When you compare you assume that this goes on for many years, and you compare the kind of learning that those children would have as compared to say another school I know in Panji where because a friend of mine wanted to get admission for his child there. So I had gone there, and where the administrator told us, look, we take children only from a particular class. We insist that the parents should know English. And it is a rule that you should not speak in any language other than English in the school. So, and it is an elite school, and no doubt the children from that school are going to go into some IIT or IIM and all that. But finally, what is the kind of education they have received as compared to this government school, which is a small model of what social democracy would or associated living would fraternity would look like. I think this is an important point because, and you see its effects in social media. I don't follow much of it, but it is truly remarkable that some of the maximum filth and nonsense is from highly educated characters living in the US, working in IT and all that. And the maximum hate is from these people who are supposed to be, the best, the cream of this country in terms of education. So where does this narrow vision come from? I do think if we have to solve those kind of issues, this Ambedkar's notion of social democracy gives us a very good point, a starting point of how what can happen when that kind of environments are not provided in the sphere of education. There are, of course, some practical challenges that, for example, what do you do in a classroom which is inherently not diverse, for example? Because of your admission criteria, you are getting children from a particular class only, or because of your location, you're getting children from a particular language background only. So these are challenges we faced in that school project, and but teachers themselves came up with answers. After all, you can give a task that take children out of that classroom situation, and they would be forced to interact with people outside their social circle. That is to say, and anyone can link this to curricular goals. For example, there is a curricular goal that children need to appreciate manual labor, the worth of manual labor. It's a very important curricular goal in our curriculum. And that gives us an opportunity for giving children this learning experience or learning task of say you have to go whichever way locality you are living, you have to go and interview some people doing manual labor. You have to frame a questionnaire, you have to ask them questions about their lives and what they earn and everything, and you have to come and report this in the class. So this is one way of just a very simple way of I'm suggesting is like, even if the classroom itself is inherently not diverse, such learning experiences can be constructed. It can be done in school, and of course, it can be done much better in a much bigger manner in institutions like yours. Now, about so here I would also like to highlight that what we are talking about here is very different, fundamentally different from what is known as diversity education, which is just about learning about different cultures and all that, some bland kind of stuff that is peddled in the West. And it is also very different from giving representation to marginalized people from marginalized groups in particular spheres. It is very different from that also, because even on that count, on reservation, it is important to realize that Dr. Ambedkar's argument was never about some kind of compensation for historical wrongs. He never used that argument. And he never, of course, asked for sympathy. So he said, you need this representation because otherwise you're going to have an extremely unfair administration. unfair, unjust administration. And similarly, you need this in politics, because otherwise the rights of some people is not going to be secure. So he's talking about and fair administration and ensuring rights for all is 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 the way in which uh, you will get a good society. This is in the way in which all of us will gain. So his argument is it is based. I have increasingly I'm coming to this understanding that it would help us to look at Ambedkar as an educator also. And he mentions this even in his South Borough Committee first kind of submission, that he says about a democracy as an educative experience. So when you have these concepts, and when you look at, for example, how he's looking at representation and how he's arguing for representation, then the point is that it is very different from the what you call representation for the sake of diversity. What I mean is that, for example, it is a requirement in because I deal with many NGOs, so it is a requirement of some funding agencies that in your managing committee you have to have Dalits, you have to have Muslim, and some women. So I mean, this is not exactly specified in so many terms, but this kind of representation is ensured. It is ensured, and of course the funding agency is very happy with that. But if going by Dr. Ambedkar's criteria, this is meaningless. This is meaningless. This doesn't serve any purpose. It is only when they have some effective voice in participation, and it is only when their voice is heard and taken into account in the decision making is that what token thing that you are doing of any value. And how important this underlying rationale is for him is we can appreciate by the decision taken by the Scheduled Caste Federation towards the end of his life, when he said that this reservation to scheduled caste in politics is not doing any, is not serving any purpose. So Scheduled Caste Federation, the party of the Scheduled Caste of India, takes it, resolves that reservation in legislature should be, in all legislative bodies, should be abolished. So because it is not serving the purpose it is serving. So the point, fundamental point is that fraternity, Ambedkar's notion of fraternity is a notion of related ultimately to the educational goal, to the goal of development of your personality. And so, and it is certainly not just a celebration of diversity. It is there is a pedagogical, fundamental pedagogical base to his notion of fraternity. Finally, I will come to his notion of Dhamma, which is explained in his last book, The Buddha and his Dhamma, where he says Dhamma is not religion. He says Dhamma is not religion. But at the same time, to explain Dhamma, he is using Buddhist texts, which is a text associated with a particular religion. So it is all quite complicated to understand. But if you go back to his piece on Buddha and the future of his religion, written in 1950, you understand that he is, when he's talking about, when he's using portraying Buddhism in this way, he's talking about basically about we can call a rational, a social, a system of ethics which is based on reason and which is conducive to and based on democratic values. But we still have this problem of why does he want to bring religion? Why does he want his act of conversion and all that? I think there the answer seems to lie that he wants this not to be just as a sort of an intellectual acceptance of some ideas or principles. He wants a very firm, conscious commitment that you have to make. So the act of conversion is actually an act of making a commitment. And he wants this to have the value of sacredness, that it is sacred, that these values are sacred. Because in religion, the religion is about the sacred, right? So he doesn't like the conventional religion, the existing religions, but he wants that value of sacredness to be that these values and this way of life should be accorded with. So they then, if given all this, then the act of conversion, and he keeps before the conversion, he tells his people that look, decide whether you really want to come with me. You don't need to come with me. Think well, properly. And then he says that you have to come wearing white dress for the conversion, and then you have to take some oaths. So what is this all about? And what is this ritual about? So as far as the white dress is concerned, again you will find something in annihilation of caste and the oaths also together concerned. You will see in annihilation caste where he is not talking about conversion to Buddhism, but still he talks about what conversion would mean. That it would mean, for example, it would mean, he says, sort of giving up an old body and becoming a new kind of person. So that is leaving aside a religion which is of rules, as he said, and adopting in annihilation, he said, adopting a religion of principles. But basically, he's talking about giving up a whole system of thought and behavior and adopting a new system of ethics, and doing this consciously, deliberately, and with a great sense of commitment. And that is why, if you look at the oaths that they have to take, the oaths are not about going to some religious places or some paying some money to some mud or something like that. The oaths are about embracing a life, what he called a democratic way of life. It's about the oath is about becoming a democratic person with compassion. So this is that powerful thinking behind that act of conversion and behind the thought of Dhamma, I think, and that is still has a great value to us, irrespective of the fact that it could be pointed out, for example, that many of his supporters did not follow the particular what he expected. They did not live up to that standards. It could also be said that we can do this without embracing Buddhism in the way he wanted. All this can be talked about, and ultimately, in any case, Dr. Ambedkar would have said it's your choice. You do what you think is best. So, but this deliberate, conscious commitment to a certain way of thinking and living, that still is of great significance to all of us in our personal lives. Is a choice we can take anytime after much thought. It is a choice maybe we have already taken, but we can still reaffirm it. And so in these ways, I think Dr. Ambedkar remains very, apart from all the inspiration that can be gained and the iconic status he will continue to have for in struggles of marginalized people, not only in India, but across the globe. But there is this other part also, which mattered to him a lot, And he was ultimately looking, seeking that every human being has to change. So this is what he was. He was, that is one of his discomforts with Marxism and communism was that you just change some social, some political systems or social systems, but you still have the same kind of human being. And that is not good enough for me. So in this case, sometimes he's very much like Gandhi, but of course they are talking of very different kind of values and ideals to be upheld. So that was what I thought I could share briefly about the significance of Dr. Ambedkar in our lives today as students and as citizens of a democracy, and people who are committed to democracy. So with these words, I think I will end my little talk. Thank you very much for listening and for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashokji. Thank you, Geetha Garu, presenting such a fascinating, work of Ambedkar. Also, the current challenges. It's marvelous. I would like to kind of open the forum for question and answer sessions. If anybody would like to kind of ask a question, kindly raise a hand. That would be useful. Also, in case if you want to kind of, you can send write a question here in chat box. I can ask whichever is convenient to you. Thank you.
There are two questions in the chat box, Sam.
Yeah.
And should I take them together, or how should I do that?
Yes, of course. Just before you respond to these questions,
okay.
I just want to make one thing, one clarification. Just when I addressed you as Geetha and then Ashok ji as G, I think some people thought that I'm kind of making some sort of gender bias. There's no disrespect intended here. I knew Geetha for a long time, maybe 20 years and so on. And so that's why I didn't use, but I understand that the public forum, so I should kind of equally treat. And so I'm adding Garu, which is kind of equivalent to G. So Geetha Garu, yes, thank you. And sorry if anybody hurt by this, whatever you call it. Yeah, please, Geetha Garu, please take those questions.
So there are two questions in the chat box. One is about the ontological wounding of caste and how does it play within the household. I think that's an interesting question, because I think one of the things that we face when we address caste in the everyday is the role that women play in either subverting or upholding the caste family. We of course know the worst case scenarios during riots. Violence against Dalits is encouraged by women from the dominant caste. We saw that in Keralanji, where an entire village of dominant caste men and women subjected Dalits to humiliation, violence, and murder. That has happened in many an instance of violence against Dalits. But in an everyday sense, and there's this very interesting volume of essays that Perumal Murugan has edited. It is, I think, translated into English also by C.S. Lakshmi, where he gets a number of people to talk about what does it mean to belong to a particular caste. And very interestingly, you see that much of that negotiation around caste happens in the realm of the household. So who will you let inside the house? Who will you serve in what plate? Who will you sort of allow into the kitchen and so on? And the decisions are made by women mostly. So clearly there's a very, very twisted experience of caste that women take on. One is, of course, that they play the roles that they're expected to play as wives and mothers in upholding the integrity of the caste family, often at great mental and psychic cost to themselves. And in recompense, they get this sense of being part of this dominant caste. And then they pass on this sort of wounding that they don't acknowledge that they are subject to onto others. So it's a very twisted logic that you have when caste sort of seeps into your everyday life and affects the way you are, your very being within the caste family itself. And that's something we need to think about continuously, because what is this investment in caste honor and identity that women hold on to, and why do they hold on to it? Is that some kind of a negative compensation for different ways in which women are not granted their individual self-worth or their equality? Or is it that to be a woman in a certain way, you have to adhere to a caste norm? Is the feminine always defined along the axis of caste? So these are questions that we can profitably think about. Thanks for that question. The other one is, how might Ambedkar be included in the curriculum, not just in political science, etc., and so on, but in literature, economics, and so on? I think it's the economics part of it is quite fascinating. I mean, you can sort of include them within the realm of economic history, if you wish. You can also put them into looking at how might one conceptualize labor, Indian labor within economics, because we've stopped talking of labor in the ways that the old political economists used to. Now they just become statistical units. But considering that much of Indian labor is within the informal sector, when so much of it is embodied service labor, caste plays a great and fundamental role in shaping the kind of laborer you are, the value that's put to your work. So I think there's a lot that you can draw from, say, his writings on labor, which are there and scattered across the volumes, which can be used in economics. And I think literature, he's just such a delightful writer. And you can use his writings in different ways. Scott Stroud talks about his power of rhetoric. You can call attention to how he works with quotations, different things that he does with writing, because he was a very careful and deliberate writer. And there's a lot that you can do with his work. I, for instance, have put together a set of texts from his oeuvre to which teachers will find useful. During lockdown, I did this session with government school teachers on Ambedkar and education, and how might you use some of that material. So I think if you're invested in his thought world, you will find different ways of bringing him into the classroom.
Thank you. Yeah, Vishnu, sir, please.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for Ashok. First question is, what kind of challenges did you encounter while writing the intellectual biography of Ambedkar? Would you just tell us a couple of those big challenges? Second, would you elaborate a little more about the multidisciplinarity in Ambedkar's intellectual life in his writing? A little more. I'm interested to know a little more about that deeply fascinating points which you mentioned.
But the challenges, well, there are many there are many challenges, but most of all, I would say, if you are working as a serious researcher, then the basic challenge is that in the way the material is available to us, the way the material is available to us, it is difficult to navigate through it the first time around. In a sense, the material is not available to us in a very organized, chronological or thematic manner. Some of the materials, much of the material in Marathi has not been translated also. So this is one basic, and this is a material of a person who was in politics. He was not out to build theories in. He was not sitting in academic institutions and building theories. He was using concepts, applying concepts in the day-to-day struggles and day-to-day politics. So whatever he uses, whatever the theory you see there, it is made in a particular context, and it is liable to change in different times or modify, and also that he is, in any case, his priority is to persuade the party on the opposite side, whoever that party may be. It's the British government or the caste Hindus. So given that particular nature, he's not speaking like Marx or Gandhi, who speak as if they are speaking for all time to come. So he very often does Dr. Ambedkar speak like that. So to extract the core concepts and the guiding principles of his thought, because as we know, he unfortunately didn't get the time to write a biography or even maintain a diary. We don't know of any diary that he maintained. So to extract his key ideas and concerns which guided his life and thought throughout over 40 years is quite a job. So that was one of the basically where you have to. In my case, it meant that reading the entire text twice, which is a lot. The first time you're just noting down some recurring ideas, and the second time you're revisiting those ideas. So that was the one of the I would say basic challenges, apart from other things like as far as understanding his thought is concerned, I would say this is the one basic challenge. Then about his multidisciplinary approach. Actually, I mean, one thing is that, when he went to Colombia, Colombia didn't have sort of rigid departments like we have today. So it was part of his education in Colombia anyway that you had to take many courses. But he went much beyond that. He took far more courses than he was required to do. And if you just take the paper caste in India itself, you will see that he is using notions of there is anthropology, social psychology, there's notion of imitation, and there is also he's referencing the Manusmriti, and then he of course doesn't bring religion there much. So, and there is a sociological understanding also. So caste in India itself can be analyzed for the multiple domains he brings there. And in the Southborough Commission submission, it is a submission to the British government about some particular political demands. But there he starts with defining what is the purpose of representation in democracy and all that. So he goes to these levels also. And then he also talks about how about caste as a about the oligarchy, about how Brahmins, about Brahmin domination. So there is sociological insight there. So in every piece, he brings this multiple. He draws from multiple domains to understand complex social phenomena, social political phenomena. And what his effort suggests is that even when he's writing about economics, he's talking about politics. Even when he's writing about economics, he's talking about politics. So, and his purpose is, even when his purpose is not to meet some academic requirement, his purpose is to understand a particular phenomenon, why it has occurred, and what challenges it poses, and what is the way out. So he, in his definition of his term, that is how he understood intellectual. That is how intellectual is different from scholar. He mentions this in one of the introductions to his book. So his multidisciplinary thing is, like I said, he didn't use that phrase, but it is a purposeful effort to understand complex realities, is how I think we can understand that. So whatever it takes to understand a reality, he will read that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ashok.
There are several general questions on caste and the economy and caste and education. I mean, I can come up with some short responses, but perhaps Ashok also might want to. One is caste and economy is an interesting question because we assume that economic transactions might sort of heed a certain economic rationality. But economic rationality itself is shaped by who has access to what. So, for instance, there's this very interesting study of the Tirupur hosiery industry, which you know is a major export industry, and the way in which capital was mocked up in its formative years. How did people set up these industries? And caste capital played a very big role. And how was caste capital amassed? Through dowries. So it's a very interesting way in which family, the caste and capital come together to create a certain kind of middle level entrepreneurship. I'm not talking about the big entrepreneurs, but so caste is both a source of entitlement, it's a source of capital mobilization, in as much as it's a social relationship. And if you look at those who had made it up the ranks in Tirupur, you'll notice that the ones who can't make it up the ranks are those who don't have any ways of amassing capital. Like those that work in the dyeing industry, many of whom are Muslims and Dalits, those that actually have to do with everyday routine assembly line tasks, most of whom are women. So caste is something that organizes production relationships in this country. So in that sense, it plays a very important role in the economy. And of course, it can provide a kind of a protective space for those who belong to that caste. So for instance, if you take a community that is into trade, like for instance, the Nadars of Tamil Nadu, who at every level in the economy, whether it's rural, small town, mofussil, or the big cities, have a very vast network of small and middle level grocery shops. And that there are these Nadar institutions called the Nadar Mahimai, which actually help each of those that contacts them to set up this business. And how do they do that? Not just by supporting them through loans, but by actually providing them with inventories of what do you need to start a shop, how do you manage credit. So it's a kind of a space where you are nurtured to become whatever it is that you wish to become. And of course, the best examples are the Brahmins reproducing their Shastric knowledge through Veda Patashalas. So caste does do that in a very fundamental sense. Whether caste is sort of because you as a universities have decided to address it, well, we've had a very long head start in addressing caste within our educational system. But as Ashok's discussion just pointed out, there is also something that pre-decides which school you will go to, no? Whether you'll go to an English medium school or a government school, whether you'll end up in a state college or whether you'll go to a private university. So I think in that sense, caste shapes our educational choices. But of course, as Ashok again pointed out, the classroom can be a very liberatory kind of space where you can actually open up discussions, open up ways of looking at each other's worlds. And I think those are the things that we can sort of see as context for challenging conversations around caste.
Thank you, Geetha Garu. Just Ashokji, I have one question. While others join, you mentioned that Ambedkar never used that historical reparation, right? Historical reparation.
Yeah.
Now I think it's going to majorly used by I think caste Hindu people only during the Constitutional Assembly debates. You're right, but I'm just wondering how do we sort of understand Ambedkar's idea of nationalization of land? In demanding for nationalization of land, was he not asking as a part of this historical reparation, or how do we understand just?
No, I didn't get as a demand.
No. So, I see that your point, that, Ambedkar never put in terms of historical reparation.
Right. Yeah.
But true.
Which particular demand you were talking about?
Nationalization of lands. Right?
Nationalization of land. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
how do we understand that, that demand, nationalization of land?
Yeah. So that there is two aspects to it. Because again, I mean, we have the way I approach all this is that I stick to just what Ambedkar said, and don't go. One can always go outside that also, but right now we'll just stick to what he said and what he thought. So this comes from two sources. One is, of course, it is a concern from one of his early papers that small holdings are the problem of small holdings. So, okay, and the problem of small holdings is to be addressed without, he said, because people in India are attached to land, and so without them losing this sense of having some property. So there are these collectives that he saw some examples in Europe, and he said that kind of system can be brought here. So that is one is there is an economic aspect to it, that agriculture has to be made more productive. He was very concerned about the low productivity of agriculture and how are we going to support this huge population. So that was one part of it. The second part of it was, of course, that he was that the large part of people living in rural India don't own any land, right? And are working only as some casual labor. So when he talks about the Land Acquisition Act, when it was discussed, although he was actually pushing forth that amendment on behalf of Nehru, he was at the same time saying this amendment is not going to help, this amendment that helps land acquisition, because it is not going to solve the problem of the landless, the people who are having no land at all. A very large number of those people, and even just by giving them land, you're not going to do anything, because they need capital. As he says in first paper, you need capital. So his solution to nationalization is basically to build the capital available for productive agriculture in an equitable manner. That is what it seems to be, and it seems to be quite different from a purely social justice argument. That is how I think it works out for him, but Geetha would have studied this better, I think.
Well, not. I think what you pointed out is very important. But the thing is, whether it's the question of small holdings or nationalization, those were ideas shared across a wide spectrum of political people in those days, from the left of the Congress to the communists. So I don't think he was saying anything exceptional, whether it's small holdings or whether it was this. But I think what is exceptional about his understanding of land economy, and this is something that might interest you, Sam, because it has to do with your home state. He was very concerned that after the Telangana armed struggle, not enough land had been made over to the Dalits. He, in fact, remarks on it. And then there is this very interesting thesis by K. Srinivasulu on the Telangana uprising in Nalgonda district, and how even Sundaraya had to accept that peasants were unwilling to part with land to the Dalits. And at the most, they could only ask for common lands or Gairan lands to be made over. So to add to what he was saying, the Dalits, not only do they not have land, but peasants are going to positively refuse access to land. And this is something that the All India Kisan Sabha recognizes. Swami Sahajanand in the United Provinces actually talks about it. And how might one deal with that? And that's a very complicated question. And it's a question that stayed with the left movement for a long time, right? Because the Kisan Sabha will ask for tenancy rights to be made permanent rights. But when it comes to landless labor, it will ask for better and higher wages. So this distribution of land to the tiller never quite marks the Dalit as a tiller. So I think he was aware of all of that as well. And of course, the whole productivist logic is there and so on. But interestingly, from the beginning, he was interested in Dalits having access to homestead and other land that they could occupy peacefully without having to be enthralled to caste Hindus. Because even when he was discussing the Damodar Valley project, for example, the extension of the project was important for him because it might free up some land for Dalits. So this whole thing of Dalits needing separate settlements of their own was also part of his understanding of homestead land and so on. It's a very, very interesting approach that he had. Problematic in some ways because he compares it to the Bantustans, which is a very unfortunate comparison with South Africa, because we know how the Bantustans fared within apartheid. But he makes that comparison. Anyway, it's a complex question, and it remains a complex question at the level of practice also, as we see with the history of the left in Andhra, in Bihar, and other places. So that's one thing. There's a couple of questions here. One second. Caste in the global scenario. Yeah, we can talk about that. The kind of religiosity that Ambedkar had throughout his life. Right. I think Ashok addressed it in some fundamental ways, Diksha, that Ambedkar was very engaged with the whole sphere of religion because he saw religion as offering a context for fraternity and solidarity. And he quotes often from the Bible to make that point. So, for example, he quotes from St. Paul several times, and he points to how it is that sense of shared brotherhood in Christ that actually made it possible for Christian martyrs to do whatever it is that they did. It was what made it possible for the Pilgrim Fathers to land in the New World and then hold themselves together through a covenant that they have made with God. He also sees Moses as driving his people from slavery in ancient Egypt because he is a man of God. And I think he uses the whole set of associative meanings around religion and sacredness and God to talk about what might actually make for fraternity in a very, shall we say, everyday fraternal shared sense. So, for example, if you read early accounts of conversion to Christianity, one of the things that you hear, especially from Dalit converts, is if some of you might be familiar with Christian doctrine, what the Eucharist means, being part of the blood and body of Christ, and that makes for a certain everyday unification with your fellow Christians and with God, and that is the basis for an experience of fraternity. Now, of course, the Christian church was plagued with caste as well, but that's another level in which one has to sort of look at religion. His later affiliation from Buddhism, yes, of course, it has to do with equality. It has to do with democracy, but it also has to do with leading a life of Dhamma in the everyday. How does one lead a life of Dhamma? So if you look at the way he understands the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, you will see that he interprets it in very specific ways. He keeps with the general meaning which is attributed to the Buddha's understanding of the Eightfold Path, but he also marks each of it with a certain significance. What is not possible in caste society? What makes you less of a human being in caste society? What prevents open and honest speech? What prevents a good act from being carried out widely, Because Ambedkar would often say, it is not that the Hindus don't have a sense of ethics, but that ethics is restricted to their own kind. So what makes for an expansive ethics? So for all of these, I think he felt that the realm of religion was where one could actually start thinking about some of these matters. And he, of course, in the event, he redefines religion. For example, an essay like Philosophy of Hinduism talks about what is theology, what is philosophy, what is comparative religion, how might one work with all these terms. I think he took religion extremely serious. And it's not an instrumental use of religion, nor is it a simple equation between democracy and Buddhism. He was also concerned with avarice, with greed, just as the Buddha was. And I think in our current scenario, those are important values also to keep thinking about. So that's where I would place it. Buddhist, Ambedkar and caste in the world context, I think today, because there is a global discourse around caste and untouchability, on account of the connectedness that is part of our lives because of social media and so on, but also that an increasing number of Bahujan and Dalit students are in universities across the world, and they take with them a lived experience of caste and untouchability. They have extremely valuable insights to offer. And they've also sort of point to how caste doesn't disappear simply because you leave India. Though at one time it did seem that was possible. If you look at the example of South Africa, for example, until there was a reverse sort of migration to India in the 1930s and 40s, South Africans did lose caste. If you look at their 19th century experiences and early 20th century experiences. Till the Arya Samaj and other groups started going to South Africa, South Africans had lost caste for South African Indians of South African origin. So I think it's an interesting question, the global discourse around caste and why do we have it in the ways that we do today. But perhaps we can also ask ourselves if sometimes we are making very quick equations, say between caste and race. Or if we imagine that there is a manner in which the US system of affirmative action offers us guidelines. Or if we think that there are ways in which we can bring together these experiences. For example, the reparations argument, which is an interesting one. I mean, the whole reparation arguments comes out of the African-American context, right? Now, if you were to think of Ambedkar's work in the Constituent Assembly, it's a counter-reparation that he wants, right? He says that until now, we have not made our own laws. It was given to us. And of course, he has the Manusmriti in mind. So human beings making their own laws is a very important historical development for him. It's contrary to what happened in the past. And while that history has been very oppressive, he looks to a future which will be very different. And that's the answer he gives women in the Constituent Assembly during the Hindu Code Bill, who feel that Ambedkar hasn't gone far enough with the Hindu Code Bill. He says, yes, we haven't gone far enough, but we have done something fundamentally revolutionary, that we have giving ourselves these laws rather than allow scripture or the Brahmins to tell us how to lead our lives. So I think he had a very interesting attitude towards time, which I think one cannot collapse into the African-American way of looking at the past. There are some interesting comparisons he makes with slavery, but he is also very clear that slavery and untouchability cannot be put on the same plane, and one has to hold them together but understand them differently.
Thank you. Ashokji, you would like to add something?
No. I think I would, as far as what Geetha mentioned about South Africa, it's similarly you see in Singapore also, so Singapore Tamils, for some time they had lost caste. So it seems that you can, from some of these migration experiences, it seems that a casteless Hindu is actually possible. But then that person doesn't exist today. It is interesting. It is interesting. One thing, incidentally, there are some basic things, sometimes which make one think. The untouchability was abolished by the constitution. But the notion of abolishing caste itself never came up to a serious debate in the Constituent Assembly. There was a practical problem about it, of course, because reservations were offered on the basis of caste jati status. So that was the sort of practical problem. But it is remarkable that at that time nobody, I mean, even I mean this because that was a time of thinking big, right? But apparently it just then didn't come on the plate. It seems that everybody realized this is going to be a very long haul. It looks like.
That's interesting, Ashok, because one of the things that Periyar has to say in the 1940s, when the Constituent Assembly debates are going on and so on, he's very unsure what Ambedkar hopes to achieve by being in the Constituent Assembly. Because he says, while he has gained a limited sort of gain, there's a limited gain in abolishing untouchability, but caste is retained. So Periyar was actually, he wrote a series of critical editorials on Ambedkar and the Constituent Assembly during that time. And Singapore is interesting, but so is the Caribbean. So the generation of Tamils who migrated in the 1840s and 50s, the first set that went to the Caribbean, they actually sort of completely intermingled with those of African and Chinese descent. And so today you have very interesting mixtures of forms of worship, of ways of being, cuisine. But I think it also takes a distance from India, and also who do you mix with and who are you to begin with? Most of these were working class Tamils, mostly Dalits perhaps. So I think that also makes for an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I remember Geetha Garu in London. Some students came to study at SOAS. So one student actually mentioned her name, along with her surname, Sharma. But there's another student, who completely, who said, I don't have a surname. So, when referring to this point, I think, they just kind of, these Tamilians actually gave up their caste. And their, these vestiges of caste, surnames or whatever, they did not keep it at all. And so she grew up, without caste. Very interesting that, upper caste actually retained, that caste tag. The lower caste actually, did not. So I think, that's a sense of liberation. And then that did not, they able to kind of pass on to their children. They can grow up as kind of, just as a human beings, without, this caste burden, in their minds. Thank you.
It happened in Burma, it happened in Malaysia, in different parts of the world for different moments in time.
Geetha, there is a small question for you from Karthik Kavale.
Yeah, I've answered it on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah.
It hasn't come to me, so I...
Okay, it's on SS on untouchability.
Oh, sorry, I answered it directly to
Karthik. Okay.
No, to Sam for some reason. I mean, let me just put that in the general thing. Yeah.
Untouchability. Excellent. I think we come to an end. Both Geetha Garu and then Ashok ji, such a fascinating, journey. Listening to both of you, learning from you. I think the realizing Ambedkar and then taking forward an Ambedkar in our everyday life, wherever you are, either in education institutions or your employment or kind of your cultural life. I think that will kind of give a lot of courage for people to kind of challenge the oppression, discrimination of whoever they are. I think that's the moral that I'm sure, like with me, all my members of faculty members, students, really thoroughly enjoyed, thoroughly learned, thank you so much. We look forward for hearing you, in the near future. This is kind of beginning, and we will, we are surely determined to kind of continue this, take forward this education on Ambedkar. Thank you, and my special thanks to Professor Vishnu, because he facilitated, we had kind of conversations with both the speakers, and then make them kind of to speak. And then thank you, Vishnu, for making that happen, and thank you all for joining this wonderful event. We look forward for your further conversations in the future. Thank you so much.